Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CCI Golden Horseshoes Condo Talk. My name is Patricia Elia from Elia Associates, and I've been asked to moderate today. Thank you to the chapter for having me. We have today as our featured speakers Laura Bryson from Switch, who's COO, and Michelle Joy from Wilson Blanchard. They're both going to bring their expertise today to help us understand this complex concept of electric charging and vehicles. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Rachel from our back office support here. Rachel, could you launch the first poll just to let us know a little bit about who's in the room today? And while she's doing that, I just wanted to let you know, if you're looking for the bios of the people who are speaking today, you can go to the events page and you can find all the information you need to know about Laura and her company, and Michelle and myself. So as you can see, we're trying to figure out who's in the room in terms of where you are in the industry: property manager, board member, owner, condo solution provider or supplier, or other. And then we'd also like to know the type of environments that you're considering as we go through this presentation. Today, we're going to have Michelle start us off after we get the results of our poll. And then we're going to hear from Laura, and she's got a wonderful presentation that hopefully is going to answer some of the questions that have been presented. People were so good and responsive to this seminar that there was a flood of questions that have come into us. Thank you very much, Rachel. So as you can see, we've got property management represented, board members, 70%, owners and condo solution providers, and other participants in the industry. And it looks like we've got a majority of high-rise and less than 150 units present. So that's good to know, because this will be a dynamic where in the Golden Horseshoes area specifically, we have townhouses as well as multi-story. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Michelle. Michelle, hi.
Hi, thanks, Patricia. Good afternoon. So I'm going to go over just a quick practical management perspective on EV charging. I've had a bit of experience with this to date, and I just kind of wanted to share some of my practical knowledge or what I've encountered to date, kind of as a segue to Laura and Patricia, because I'm going to be honest, I'm still figuring out all the answers and solutions here. So I'm going to leave it to some of the professionals to kind of address some of these challenges or concerns I've faced along the way. So first and foremost, I know as per the poll, majority of our attendants are in multi-residential buildings. So high-rise or low-rise, it was quite a few, not too many in the townhouse. And I think that's because the challenge of EV charging from my perspective is not as difficult in the townhouse condominium setting. If you have a driveway and a garage, it's very easy for you to install a charger on your own for your vehicle. And then most townhouse sites have visitor parking. So if the corporation decided they wanted to install a community charger, there's ample visitor parking for them to maybe set up 1 or 2 spaces. But to date, it's not something I've really encountered. A lot of inquiries from my townhouse corporations that I've worked with. I don't see many putting in community chargers yet. That could obviously change. But yeah, so quick note on the townhouses. I don't see that's where you're facing a lot of challenges. And I think from our attendee polls, we have a lot of interest from high rises, because that's where I can certainly say it becomes a lot more complex. So I just want to highlight some challenges that I've encountered with multi-residential high-rise, low-rise buildings. So my particular experience has been with 2 high-rise corporations located in a central downtown core, deeded parking spaces, and absolutely 0 visitor parking, no visitor parking. So no common element parking, just specifically deeded parking spaces in a multi-level parking garage. So what challenges does that face? The only option for charging is charging right to your parking space, which is great. People want to, maintain their parking spot and have the ability to charge right there in the spot that they already have. But some of the issues with that is, if you've got a 3-level garage, there's only so many electrical rooms in that parking garage. So depending on where your parking spot is located, you could be paying a higher cost than others to get the electricity to that parking space. And and what does that entail to get the electricity to that parking space? And when they're deeded parking spaces, you can't simply just swap a parking spot with someone else. It's a legally owned unit. So there's a lot more involved in that aspect of it. No visitor parking, like I mentioned. 2 of the buildings where I worked on this type of project with, 0 visitor parking. So it's not even like they had an option to install some community chargers in a visitor parking area. The only option they had was in the parking garage at the deeded units. And then another kind of comment on the community parking is that if you do have visitor parking, in most buildings in the Golden Horseshoe area, it is found outside of the property. I know some buildings have visitor parking underground, most are above ground. So even if you decide to go with a community charger in a visitor parking area, if I have a lovely underground parking spot, I don't want to charge my car outside in the weather, winter, rain, whatever it is. I'm probably going to want to keep my car in the garage as opposed to outside under the elements. Another big thing that I've encountered and just kind of in learning how this process works is, what's your supply capacity from your hydro distributor? And I know Laura's going to get into this a little bit more, but once you kind of endeavor into this project, you'll learn that you do not have unlimited electrical supply for these charging stations. So you need to look into what capability your building has. And again, I know Laura's going to talk about this a little bit more. Rachel, I think do we have a poll that I could launch right about now? So as I'm talking about these challenges, we have a question: what factor do you find most intimidating when considering implementing and retrofitting electric vehicle charging? So we've given a few options and you can select all that apply, just to kind of see if you've encountered the same challenges that I'm talking about here now. And we'll just wait for those results to come up.
So Michelle, while you're waiting for the results to come up, are you finding that the electric vehicle solution is pretty unique and custom to the condo itself?
100%, yeah. There's not a one size fits all approach, because like I said, it first is going to come down to how your building is constructed. Like I said, visitor parking, deeded, exclusive use parking spaces. It's going to come down to, I mean, it can also come down to when your building is built. We have a lot of 30, 40-year-old high rises that we work with. The newer builds, though, I know that the developers are looking future forward and actually retrofitting the garages so that they can accommodate the chargers. So I think it also depends on the age of your building. So it's definitely not a one size fits all. So we've got our poll results. And it looks like, let's see where our biggest concerns are. So budgeting, how to implement EV charging costs effectively. Electrical capacity constraints was another big concern. Starting the process, there are so many factors to consider. And I agree 100%. One of the biggest things I find with condo boards is that they get intimidated by the process. There are so many factors that come into play: legal, practical, the costs, the budget, the equipment, that they almost get, it's too much. It's not whereas when your roof is leaking or your walls or your windows are leaking or your parking garage is crumbling, you can't ignore that. That is something that you need to spend the time to focus on. EV charging or retrofitting your building, being proactive to retrofit your building for EV charging, is not an absolutely necessary project you need to take on. So I find they often get intimidated and it gets pushed by the wayside because it's just too overwhelming.
So you're saying that condo directors don't get paid enough to be that proactive?
Unfortunately, it's not a huge salary. So it's, but I think, and as we'll see from Laura, that there's more and more companies or solutions becoming available that will definitely ease this for property managers, but really for condo boards. So I just want to give a couple suggestions before I segue into our other panelists, just from a management perspective. First and foremost, because Patricia will be touching on this later, there have been some changes to the Act in what corporations are obligated to do in response to EV charging requests. So if you get one, consult with your corporation's lawyer and make sure that you're following the requirements set out in the Act to follow those guidelines. It's going to be a huge help to you. Always consider the long-term effect. So again, like I said, your building is only going to have so much capacity. So think about the long-term effect of allowing 1 or 2 Tesla superchargers in your parking garage. You're not going to get a whole bunch of chargers if you're installing superchargers. Also think about the agreements that you're putting in place. If you're going to put an agreement in place for one individual, you're setting a precedent for the rest of the owners. So think about not just one EV charging agreement, think about 5, 10 agreements, how you're going to manage all of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let me see if I have any other great key takeaways. Another key takeaway, which again, Laura's going to dive into a little bit more, review your management contract and speak with your management professionals. A lot more management companies and management agreements are putting in a provision which basically says that property managers are not meter readers. We're not going to check your hydro sub meters on a monthly basis and reconcile the account. So if that's something you're expecting your management provider to do for these EV charging stations, talk to them about it first to make sure that that's something they're willing to do for you. I think, Rachel, we have another poll now. Okay, so how soon do you expect to implement EV charging infrastructure in your community? This is good to know because we're going to be highlighting some timely information towards a little bit later on in our presentation that may change your mind on the timeline for installation at your community. Or maybe you've been thinking about it and you've done some legwork, but you haven't pulled the trigger. I think Laura might have some interesting information that may change your mind or speed up the process on your behalf. Just waiting for those poll results to come in. All right, so majority of attendees say within the next 2 to 3 years, 53%, and then split 20 and 20 between within the next year, not in the foreseeable future, 8% within the next few months. So that's kind of my quick overview of the management perspective. Like I said, it's not a detailed segment here because I'm still learning it all. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Laura now, and she's going to handle talk to you about the practical installation of the EV charging. And before she gets started, we have one last poll. What type of charging are you considering implementing? So private, which would be specifically for the use of one owner, community. So like I said, a couple charging stations in the visitor parking area, both unsure, don't really know the difference, need to learn more before making a decision. And again, Laura's going to break down some of this content for you when it comes to the practical installation of these different options and what type of charging options are available for your communities. Wow, we are literally split quarter each way. So private, community, both unsure. So that's great because I think Laura's presentation will certainly help maybe make up some minds or learn a little bit more about what your options are. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Laura.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about preparing multifamily buildings for growing electric vehicle adoption. I'm Laura Bryson, and I'm here with Switch Energy Inc. We are a Toronto-based company that provides end-to-end electric vehicle charging and energy management solutions for multifamily buildings. So I'll start out with a bit of context because I know that everyone is coming into this space and with very different knowledge bases. So let's look a little at the EV sales in Canada. We've been seeing year-over-year growth in EV sales, both in plug-in hybrids and fully battery electric vehicles. There's about 200,000 EVs on the road in Canada today. And there are different factors that are driving this. Partially, it's improvements in battery technology and longer range EVs that are coming to market. Consumer preferences are changing. And there's even federal and in some cases provincial rebates that are helping spur the adoption. There's a lot of different motivators for different groups for why they would want to install EV charging. I think it comes down to demand. At this stage, many properties are getting requests to install EV charging infrastructure, and it's just pure demand from residents. And then in terms of the long-term value, it's a way to protect and grow your property values to differentiate yourself from other multifamily buildings, because certain residents are going to require this as more and more EV owners adopt these new types of vehicles. The home and the workplace are the two most important places for charging because it's the most convenient place to charge. You can kind of think of it like charging your cell phone. You plug it in when you get home and then it's ready to go the next morning. And another factor is sustainability. Certainly for retail settings and for other commercial organizations that are trying to promote themselves as leaders in sustainability in helping promote the adoption of electric vehicles. In terms of the three different kinds of electric vehicle or of EV charging types, you can really think of three types. Level 1, which is just like your regular outlet at home that you use to plug in your laptop or your cell phone. You can actually charge a full battery electric vehicle with a level 1 charger, but it's going to take a really long time. So we don't really recommend that for multifamily or workplace settings. Level 2 is really the sweet spot. It uses the equivalent of a dryer plug, and it's perfect for workplace and home where vehicles spend a good amount of time parked. So, but compared to DC fast charging, for example, where this is more common along highways or other public destination settings, it's not as expensive. When you're looking at the DC fast charging infrastructure, it's upwards of 50 to 100K, including the hardware and installation costs, which it's just really not feasible in these multifamily settings. It's difficult to get that sort of utility connection, and it's difficult to justify the infrastructure costs. So level 2 charging is really that sweet spot. And we get a lot of questions about, but is it fast enough? There are higher output level 2 charging stations that you can look at, but given that EV owners don't really care how long it takes to charge your vehicle, they just want it to be ready the next morning. It is a very feasible option for these multifamily buildings. And we alluded to this, the different types of charging models in multifamily buildings in the poll. There's really two types: private, which is 1-to-1, one charger to one resident. And this is very common in condo settings or other multifamily buildings where there isn't necessarily access to community parking, or the residents just prefer to have the convenience of their own private charger. And the other model is shared charging. So this could be in a mixed use or visitor parking area. And really the difference is just that ratio of EV owners to charging stations and then in the management. So for a private charging model, typically if there's, if these are networked charging stations that are connected to the internet, that monthly network management fee would be paid by the individual resident. Whereas for the shared charging, it's usually paid by the property manager or the building owner as they're providing this amenity to their residents. So this is a really detailed but important slide where we're going to look at three of the main approaches to electric vehicle charging in multifamily buildings. The first one being tying a non-network charger to a sub-metering system. And again, I'll define networked, meaning it's connected to the internet for things like remote control and monitoring. So in this first approach here, the chargers are not internet connected, and the way that they handle the automatic payments is through a sub-metering company. So each charging station is tied to an individual sub-meter. And so the challenges of an approach like that is you don't have access control, so anyone can just show up and start charging. You can't assign charging usage to individual residents. And then you don't have any sort of load management. So if you do exceed your capacity, essentially you can only support a certain number of charging stations. It's limited. Now, another option is tying non-network chargers to a smart panel. And I'll compare this to the approach where you have networked smart charging. So in the middle here, the charging stations are connected to a cloud-based system, and all of the control is at the charger level, compared to on the far right with the smart panel, where the control is actually at the panel itself. And so with the smart panel, you can have automatic payments, and you can have limited load management. It's essentially limited to on and off functionality. So if you exceed the capacity, say you've got 5 EV owners that are charging at once, and you've only got capacity for 3, then when those other 2 EV owners go to plug in, they have to wait to start charging until the others finish charging. So if we compare that to the network smart charging approach, the difference is that you get dynamic load management. You can simply split the load dynamically between EV owners to make sure that everyone gets a charge and that you're meeting their charging requirements in the most cost-effective way. In terms of what load management is in the first place, you can think of it as a way to share limited available capacity. So every building has an existing electrical capacity, and load management allows you to effectively share that capacity between chargers or between EV owners. And there's different schools of thought in terms of how many chargers can be shared on, for example, one circuit or one panel. But the rule of thumb is generally not going any higher than a 1-to-3 or a 1-to-4 ratio, which is enough based on studies of electric vehicle ownership to meet the charging needs of most EV owners living in urban settings.
Can I ask you a question here, Laura, on this? But
Sure.
is this going to change the ratio as the cars themselves change? Like, could there also be a consideration for future types of models where the ratio might go down or the ratio might increase?
So, I mean, there's different types of EVs. There's plug-in hybrids that have a really small electric range, and then there's full battery electric vehicles that have a higher electric range. So, I mean, I guess one way to think about it would be that you need less energy to support those plug-in hybrid EV owners. I think the technology is only going to get more sophisticated in terms of the different ways that you can load manage. For example, a decade ago, we were looking at just sort of static load management of on and off functionality, whereas today, load management can be dynamic, not only based on capacity and demand, but also driver input preferences. So drivers can input, they say, I need my vehicle charged by this time, and then it'll automatically allocate the output based on all those factors.
So boards, when they're designing, should think ahead to, where the industry may go. But if they're thinking about making the investment, they should be considering sort of the parameters, like the most reasonable parameters today and maybe a few years out in order to address the design.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, the biggest changes that we'll see are the infrastructure in public settings, because charging is getting faster. And so for those highway settings, those public destinations where people need to get from point A to point B, they need fast charging to finish their journey. I think that's where most of the technological improvements going to come. But in terms of the multifamily buildings, it's a bit of a different model because you don't need it to be as fast. And you do need to be really cognizant of the infrastructure costs, especially for retrofitting where they weren't necessarily designed to have EV charging in the first place.
Fair. Thank you.
Yeah, so a takeaway for this slide is just that load management is a way to not only limit your infrastructure costs up front by sharing the available capacity, but also to prevent or delay the need for future upgrade costs as more residents request access to charging. One factor that is important to consider is open standards. In the EV charging industry, the standard for communication is called Open Charge Point Protocol, OCPP. And you can think of it like an unlocked cell phone. So each of these level 2 charging stations that I've displayed here, these are all open standards compliant. And that means that they work with a variety of service providers. And it's a really important question to ask a potential service provider because you don't want to be locked into a specific service provider. You want to have choice not only in the hardware features and pricing, but you want to have options for service down the line if you're not happy with the service, if prices increase. So it's the best way to future-proof your investment. I won't spend too much time on this slide because we're going to touch on it later in more detail, but I did want to flag an opportunity for funding, which is offered by the federal government here in Canada. It's called the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program, ZEVEP for short. And the information that I've put on this slide, it's based on the 2020 program. The details for the 2021 program should be released shortly. The new round is opening up in February, likely towards the end of the month. So it provided, excuse me, up to $5,000 per charging station and up to $5 million per organization. Now there was a requirement to install a minimum of 20 chargers, but I wouldn't get bogged down with the eligibility criteria. Don't let that prevent you from looking into it and further. There's lots of ways to become eligible by working with other groups. And the goal of the program is really to support charging infrastructure in places where Canadians live, work, and play. So it's relevant to multifamily buildings, to workplaces, and even public and on-street charging. And as part of the process, Switch, my company, will essentially provide full application and reporting support. So this is, I think, the last slide I have here, last formal slide before we get into more of the Q&A. But I did want to highlight 6 really important questions to ask your service provider as you start thinking about how to go about this, whether you're reaching out to a service provider like Switch or you're contacting your preferred electrical contractor. These are 6 questions that it's important to ask. So first is about access control. Does the solution that you're buying, does it offer access control, or can anyone just show up and start charging for free? The second is around energy metering billing. Does the solution offer energy metering and billing automatically, or will the property be responsible for manually reading meters and billing residents? As Michelle mentioned, it's really not a scalable solution, and most properties don't want to be in the business of reading meters or getting into the metering or billing. 3, is the solution truly open standards? So that refers to the slide where I was talking about OCPP. A good question to ask is, if I buy this hardware, am I locked into you as a service provider, or do I have choice in service provider? Number 4, does the solution offer scalability, long-term scalability, or is it really only going to meet the needs of the first 1 or 2 residents that are requesting access to charging? 5 is around dynamic load management. It's important to find out, does the solution offer dynamic load management, or is it limited to on and off functionality? And then finally, this is the network component. Is the solution internet connected? And the reason this is so important is because it allows for remote monitoring and control and diagnostics. And then also the government funding requirements. They actually, one of the main criteria of the eligibility for that program is that the charging station is internet connected, for example, remote monitoring, control, and anonymized data sharing. So with that, I will open it up to more of a panel Q&A style. And
just before we get there, I think I'm just going to do the legal part and then we'll go to Q&A.
Okay.
Just because I think we need to do an overview of legal. So, because I've noticed the questions coming in, there are some legal ones, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And as well, we'll talk a little bit more about the government support on the program as well. So thanks, Laura. I think that was a great overview. And I've noticed in the chat and the Q&A, tons of more questions. One of the questions is there anything in the Condo Act that requires a corporation to accommodate owners' requests for chargers in deeded spots when community chargers are available in visitors? It's a great question. Just because this is not legal advice, and as Michelle has pointed out, each condo is unique. You need to sort of get a legal opinion to confirm the parameters around your condo. So I'm just going to give an overview though. In terms of the law and the infrastructure, May 1st, 2018 were when the changes under the Condo Act came into force and effect around electric vehicle charging systems. And, these provisions, which are embodied in the Act and the regs, set out the process for condominium corporations to approve the installation of electric vehicle charging stations and set out a process for owner requested installations. So let's talk about the two arms of this. The first is when the installation is by the corporation. If a corporation wishes to install an EVCS in the common elements or an electric vehicle charging station of the condominium corporation, they may be able to do so without a vote of the owners, or they may need to provide owners with an opportunity to vote on the installation. Two important thresholds, and I also mentioned this is on the common elements. So I'm not addressing the question that was posed by Marlene about deeded spots. So no vote is required if the corporation wants to install an EVCS if the estimated cost of the installation is less than 10% of the annual budgeted common expenses, and in the opinion of the board, owners will not regard the installation of the EVCS as negatively impacting the use and enjoyment of units, common elements, or the assets of the corporation. So if a corporation wants to take this route, there's a specific process as well. And you'll notice that this is paralleled very much to 97, right? So this is very much in line with 97, 98 concepts of the Act. So the board must provide notice to owners, which includes a description of the proposed installation, estimated costs for the installation and how the corporation will pay for the costs, a statement indicating that the board believes that the owners would not consider the installation to reduce the use and enjoyment of common elements or units or assets, and any other information that the bylaws of the corporation may require. So again, that corporate governance framework that indicates the choices of the community can specify other elements that will impact the approval of this. After the notice has been sent and 60 days have passed, the corporation may begin the installation of the EVCS, but 60 days means 60 days notice, and that means people can requisition a meeting. There's a possible vote for owners as well if the estimated cost of the installation is more than 10% of the annual budgeted common expenses. And so this is where the notice must again contain the same information, a copy of Section 46 of the Act and Section 24.2 of the Ontario Regulation, and other information required by the bylaws. And it must say that the owners have a right to requisition the meeting. So this is the other thing, is whether or not you have to proceed with this notice. You have to do the calculation, get the professional opinion, and have the resolution. And in the latter case, and I need to correct myself, in the latter case, because it's over 10%, if you get the requisition, you have to have the meeting and there has to be a vote. If you don't get the requisition, you can proceed. But in the first case where it's under 10%, it's just about notice. Finally, the second one, which is the more complex one, is installation by owners. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time here. If a condo owner wants to install an EVCS, a process which is defined under the regulation 24.4 to 24.6, they can seek approval from the corporation. So what do you need? You need a written application. The owner must create an application and deliver it to the corporation. The application must identify the owner's address for service, be signed by the owner. More importantly, it's also got to include the drawing, specification, or other information regarding the installation. The corporation has an obligation to respond to the owner's requests for information and permission or authorization, but there is a process. Once the application has been submitted, the corporation will have 60 days to respond to the application. This can be extended by agreement of the parties. For example, you need more detail, more information, but you want to keep the application alive. The corporation can only reject the application or request for installation if, based on the opinion or the report of a qualified professional, so this is the corporation now investing, the installation would be in violation of the Condominium Act or any other legislation. The installation would adversely affect the structural integrity of the property, and or the installation poses a health or safety risk to the condo or the occupants. So it's pretty broad, leaves it open. And it's not then that if the corporation approves it, that we're done. You still have to then go step 3, which is developing the agreement. The agreement is where we manage the risks. And we've talked about Section 98 agreements. The thresholds are going to be very similar here. We're going to be managing things in the same way. But it's also an allocation of responsibility for the installation, responsibility for costs, insurance, and repairs for the electric vehicle charging station, and any other risks that have to be managed. Costs are generally here carried by the owner. And this is the thing, people, when the owner comes to the table and has to negotiate the agreement, the costs will be borne by the unit owner, primarily. That is just a general statement and how these sections work. If we go via the corporation, it becomes common expense and everybody pays for it. As well, there's a dispute resolution mechanism contemplated. Any disagreement between the owner and the condominium regarding the installation of an EVCS must be submitted to private mediation and arbitration within 6 months of the dispute. If the dispute is not raised within 6 months, the owner's application is considered to have been abandoned. So that's a quick overview of managing the process. And the question is, should boards and condos be proactive in thinking about it? And where are the roots of this? Because I think this is also the other thing. Michelle had brought up a really good point, is how motivated are you to get this done? When we looked at the poll, we saw timelines that were varying, but 2 to 3 years seemed to be the strongest batch of results. What we all need to appreciate is that this is part of a shift in public policy. So therefore, it's going to be a shift in laws as well. And the point is how do we transition older properties, even older cars, and implementing these changes into our lives? And what are the opportunities out there for us to do this? Now, what I think is important here is maybe we go back to Laura and we talk a little bit more about the funding program, because these are one of those incentives that are being put in place to actually bring policy forward. And then what we can do is do a question and answer. Does that work, ladies? Is that okay? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, so Laura, I don't know if you want to go back to your slide so that everybody can see sort of the elements, and then you can give a brief overview of how that process works. Because I think when we were prepping for this, timing was key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just pull that up again.
Sure, not a problem. And ladies and gentlemen, just so you know, Elia Associates, I was doing some research. We did an article way back in 2018, which is a little older now, but has some of the historic basis for some of the climate change policy. And so we've provided you with a little background of where government policy and laws have gone. You can find that on the website if you need it, and I'll try and find the link. But it's under the collection of articles, just for your edification if you want to bring it to your boards. There you are, Laura, go ahead.
Awesome. So yeah, we've spoken a little bit about the zero emission vehicle infrastructure program.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, the program was built in different streams. So for example, last May and June, there was a stream open specifically for multifamily buildings, for workplaces, and for fleets. And prior to that, about a year before, the stream was open to public and on-stream charging infrastructure. For 2021, the program that's opening up at the end of the month, and it'll be open until May, it is open to all streams. So it can be for multifamily buildings, workplaces, fleets, public, commercial. And the details in terms of exactly how much will be provided, it hasn't been released yet, but we expect it to be similar to the program in 2020, which was up to $5,000 per charging station. And it includes not only the cost of the charging stations, but also the electrical infrastructure. So likely for these retrofits, you're going to need some sort of upgrade, whether it's new panel, new transformer. All of that is considered eligible under the program, even including signage, painting, that kind of thing. And in terms of the program, what they're really looking for, they're going to be looking for some sort of demonstration that this is really benefiting and propelling EV ownership in Canada. So they want to see that potentially you've done surveys to see what the demand is like in the building, and that you're providing or increasing access to X number of residents within the building. And the application itself can be a bit intimidating. So that's why I would recommend reaching out to a service provider that has experience submitting these types of applications, because they can guide you through what types of things they might be looking for. But they'll also make sure that you are eligible and that the technology that you are implementing is eligible. Because one of the important criteria is the connected requirement for the charging stations to be connected to the internet for anonymized data sharing. And that comes with a whole suite of benefits that I mentioned earlier in terms of the access control, the automatic energy metering and billing, and dynamic load management. So are there any specific questions from the audience on the program itself?
I don't see any specifically in the Q&A, and ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will definitely get to them. So I don't see anything specific, but I have a question. Mm-hmm. So if you were going to plan to do this year, like what are the deadlines and what kind of decision making has to happen? And what, sort of what is the outside end deadline?
Yeah, that's a great question. From our experience, it does take a bit of time because there are so many factors to consider. So the absolute deadline is to have everything in and submitted is May 2021.
Yeah.
But I would recommend having everything prepared, within at least a few weeks before, so you can even submit early. Depending on the service provider that you work with, the turnaround time for an EV charging plan can be pretty quick. It usually starts with that survey in tandem with doing a site visit where you can get a sense of what the electrical capacity is. Usually a load review is required, especially if you're looking at going the private charging route, and adding private charging into the building is going to increase the total energy load so much. But the EV charging service provider would walk you through what a plan would look like. I know Michelle had spoken a little bit about her experience with, for example, putting a panel on each level, which will essentially help lower the costs for individual residents to get a private charger at their own parking spot. So what you can do is start with that base infrastructure to get the property EV ready, and then add charging stations as individual residents request it.
Yeah, that's exactly what the building I worked with, they actually didn't have any requests for EV charging, but they wanted to get ahead of the game and make sure that when they came in, the requests came in, they had a manageable program available. So they did the research about load management, capacity. They expanded their infrastructure with the multiple panels. So, which I think is really great. They were proactive in that project.
And Laura, I have another question for you. So in terms of getting a load assessment, does the service provider provide that service with an in-house engineer, or is that something that has to go out to a third-party engineer for the corporation, for example? And then that report is relied on by the service provider?
It varies. It depends on the company that you want to work with.
Okay.
Because it's usually flexible. Okay.
Thanks. So Michelle, did you want to kick us off with starting with some of the questions? Because I know we have a lot.
Yeah, not a problem. We have, just for clarification, we have a couple in the Q&A. Do you want me to flip to that, or do you want me to flip to our list?
You can go to the Q&A, sure. That's totally fine.
All right. That one you answered already. So one that came up, and I actually don't even have a 100% answer for this, so this might be something to look into further, but would the installation of these EV chargers affect the corporation's insurance? Is it required to advise the corporation's insurance providers about these changes to the common element, as I assume it can be assessed as a change to the common element of the corporation? So I think first and foremost, identifying that question would be, and I think Patricia, you touched on this when talking about agreements. If it's I would define as a community charger, then I think the responsibility falls on the corporation. If it's a deeded parking space charger, I would assume that the responsibility would fall to the owner to ensure that there's insurance on it. I don't know if you have any further comment on that one.
Yeah, I would agree that the Section 98 template agreement or concept, it always manages risk by allocating risk back to the unit owner, thereby not impacting the corporation's insurance, but also spreading the risk into different policies. And so that would be one way to manage it and not impact the corporation's insurance.
Okay. And just
Laura,
to add, I know Switch, for example, we usually enter into a service agreement with the property as we provide an automated energy metering and billing service. So as part of that, it covers those insurance and liability.
Okay, and that's good to know. It's something to ask for a service provider as well. There's a question here, Laura, which I think might be good for you, which is what is a typical cost for a service provider completing the federal application process for EVCS?
So I'm not aware of companies charging to help with the application process. I think there's usually an understanding that, the EV charging service provider would be doing all of the legwork in terms of providing a plan and quoting everything out, and actually providing the solution when the application is successful.
Okay, and so, all right, so there's no rebate or commission or any other piece that goes back to, well, I guess it depends on the model of the service provider.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the service provider. Switch doesn't charge for that.
Okay. There was a question that was provided to us in advance, which is sort of legal. So I'm gonna answer this one. Why is there such a big price range for lawyers' fees when adding an EV charging station to the title? We have seen from $300 to $2,000. I guess, per agreement. I think it depends on how you approach it, to be honest. If you're going to do it from the unit owner perspective and the application process, it depends when you get legal involved, first of all, in terms of do they design the application with the board to create the standards? Then if you're looking at the agreement itself, it would also depend on how this is being modified to address the legal interests of the unit owner. Is it a modification that is coming fully through the common elements into an exclusive use common element? Is it a unitized parking spot? So there's a lot of variation here that legal has to think about in order to affect a binding agreement on the unit owner. I think as well, it also depends on the content of the agreement. These agreements can be very comprehensive in their nature in identifying risk and then allocating risk and responsibility back to the appropriate party. And then as well, do you negotiate? Sometimes on Section 98 agreements that are very straightforward common element modifications, for example, townhouse complex wants to put a unit owner wants to put a post box on the front door or front entryway. Could be relatively straightforward if we're going to do a bulk Section 98 agreement for every unit owner. That way we can share the cost and it's pretty standardized. And that's what I'm getting at. It depends on how custom your solution is, and that where the range could be in the costs.
Patricia, there's two questions that came up that I think are interesting because I actually put them on my original speaking notes and I didn't touch on it, and the question flagged it.
Sure.
So I talked about the ability to put in some community charging stations. So if you have a visitor parking lot, the board decides to put in community charging stations. How would a corporation tackle? I mean, most corporations have a rule that says no owners can park in visitor parking. How do you tackle if that's the solution you want to go with? How do you approach that with your rules?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the thing is, but it's a great question, right? Because it really shows a level of thinking the whole process through. And what you would do is you'd have to look at your corporate governance, you'd look at your rules, and then you'd figure out how are we going to accommodate because you're accommodating charging and visitor parking requirements. And first, can you do that? Like, is it a viable solution to put your EV charging station there? And if it is, then I think what you do is you adapt your rules to fit in this template of charging and how it operates. But you'll still have to make sure you meet your requirements for visitor parking too. So that's another consideration, right? If you set up a charging station that's communal.
Yeah, I encountered this with the corporation recently, but a lot of corporations don't realize that your site plan is approved based on the number of visitor parking spaces you have available. So you can't just simply lease them or give them to owners. That actually is a requirement for site plan approval when your property is constructed based on your municipality. So
it's satisfying those ratios, right? And then getting, if sometimes we hope that the visitor parking is excess and that you have excess capacity, and that's what you're using. And it might just be, people getting used to the idea that you have 2 less parking spaces for visitors. That doesn't always go over well in the holidays when we can visit each other, but that's not applicable right now. But we'll get back to that one day. And so people will be concerned about that. So I think it's a valid question. It has to be explored a little bit on municipal levels. Did you say there was another question that came to your attention?
Laura is taking care of the Q&As, but let me pull one from one of our, if you have one handy and ready to go, and I will pull one from our list that we have.
Yeah, sure. Let me see. So I think we've covered what the legal requirements. There's a question here. If a parking space owner wants to install in their space and agrees to associated costs with installation, how is the owner charged for energy consumption? I.e., is the charger tied to the corporation's account or a new account or to the existing account as the unit? Ideally, not involving the corporation as an intermediary for charging electricity costs to the unit owner. Great question, shows the complexity. Laura, did you want to jump in and start us off on that discussion?
Sorry, I was just getting a bit caught up in some of the Q&A. Told
you you'd be popular today, Laura. So, you know, Laura, I think the question is billing here. If somebody comes to the board, says, you know, we'd like to have this, then the board has this complex idea in the how to address this. Let's say it's common element. Somebody wants to be, the board doesn't want the onus, right? Michelle, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying managers don't want to manage the billing of this.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Right.
We do a lot of things. We don't want that responsibility, and I don't think it should fall on the board either. I think you should find a third-party solution, long-term solution.
So Laura, what are the solutions that you see out there?
Yeah, so let me go back to the slide where I show the 3 different approaches. The solution is really either a networked smart charging system or a smart panel that takes care of the automatic billing for you. So whether it's at the panel or the charger level, having some sort of automatic metering that's tracking the energy consumption and billing residents directly. And I mean, it varies based on where geographically you're located, but I think a good standard is about anywhere from 85 cents to $1.50 per hour of charging.
Mm-hmm.
And a company like Switch would essentially handle all of that on your behalf. So residents will activate the charger with an RFID tap card or with a mobile app, and then track the energy consumption and send funds to the property on a quarterly basis to make sure they're recouping costs. And I know condo corporations are technically nonprofit organizations, so they're not supposed to be generating a profit, but there is an opportunity to set a higher usage rate to help recoup some of the upfront
capital costs, right? Yeah, and I agree. And I think Laura brings up an excellent point, which is, you know, it's not profit in a condo, but it definitely will, you know, help deal with the infrastructure implications of these solutions. You know, and may also incentivize condos to go down the path of making the investment if there's a way to recoup the costs over time. So I think that's something that you should talk to your service providers about. So one other question based on what you said, Laura, accounts receivable, then, is that something that a service provider should ideally manage? Because in a condo, generally, you know, if we have an ability to charge back amounts that are owed, we do that, but we have a time frame within which to do that and lien for it, which gives us a priority. So we always want to make sure that the condos' rights and interests are well managed. But are you saying that you take care of managing accounts receivable, or does that come back to the condo at any time, for example?
No, it doesn't come back to the condo. It's handled exclusively by a company like Switch or another charging service provider. So that property managers don't need to play any part in that. They just, every quarter they receive a lump sum and a report showing what the usage was.
Okay, great.
So that's safe to say if a corporation has that experience with unit utility submetering, it's a very similar type of fee collection process where a third party collects it. I think a question came up and I don't know if it was answered. I'm assuming there's a service charge for the administration of the service of collecting, and then the corporation gets the rebate to apply towards the utility that they've spent on.
Yeah, so that's a great question to ask the service provider, is what they're charging as you're comparing different options out there, because the service fee per transaction could vary quite a bit. I think there's companies charging up to 30% per charging transaction. So it's important to understand what those costs are.
Okay. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but there were some on the list that I wanted to try and bunch together. And this one may be applicable to a townhouse. We have an open parking lot where each owner owns one parking spot. One owner has recently approached management about installing service to his parking spot for an electric vehicle. The problem is that electric access would be required through the common areas, lawn, sidewalks, curb. Where do we start? We have recommended that he present his change request to the board and to provide his intentions and how he plans to initiate installation. We've also mentioned that he will need to have an indemnity agreement registered. This is actually a really good approach. And because it's coming from the unit owner, technically those costs could be put onto the unit owner if that's what they want to affect. But, there was another question in this group that says, what are the legal implications to retrofitting? Laura's brought this up, and Michelle has in her examples also talked about, upgrading our infrastructure and how we do this. I think there has to be a balance. And one thing I wanted to bring to people's attention from my experience was that I had a townhouse complex where a hydroelectric service provider was coming in to upgrade. What we did is we actually approached the hydroelectric service provider to say, could you please increase the capacity of the upgrade to ensure that we can have EV charging at each of the townhouses as we go through? The hydroelectric service provider said, oh, we had never thought of that. But, we really sort of need to think ahead in terms of infrastructure planning. So I also think that it might be a discussion that boards need to have with their reserve fund planners, their engineers, and say, what does this look like for the corporation in the future if we're going to expand our capacity? Because it will be an increase and upgrade to our existing infrastructure. But if we're in older condos and our infrastructure is nearing its lifespan end or it's getting older, should we not be thinking about what is a reasonable standard in today's reality, right? Where we're seeing more electric vehicles. Michelle, Laura, do you want to jump in here on your thoughts on planning for the future?
I 100% agree with you. Like I said, one of the corporations that I worked with kind of did that. They were newer, so it was proactive as opposed to part of overall maintenance and repair during the life of the corporation. But that's exactly what they did, was they upgraded the infrastructure for future. They didn't have 5 requests waiting for them, but they wanted to upgrade to make sure that they could handle those requests adequately when they did come in. And talking to your hydro service provider, certainly part of it. So I think it's a great point, Patricia, is talk to your reserve fund planners and put that in when you're doing those study updates.
Definitely. And I just want to add that
oh, did we freeze? Hold on. Oh, I think you're just frozen, Laura. So just give yourself a second. And there was a good question here. How long can the corporation, how can a corporation generally recoup the costs? Well, I think, part of what we're talking about here is planning for it in your reserve fund. And Laura brought up a great point in terms of the rates that are charged for charging. That might be another way to collect the costs of the investment back over time. So therefore, all the generations of unit owners get the benefit of that.
Patricia,
Laura?
there was.
Okay.
Oh,
go ahead.
we lost
She's
Laura.
good. She's going to come back in. All right. Go ahead, Michelle.
There was two of the same questions. Was, can the corporation use the reserve fund for this infrastructure upgrade? So if it's, let's pose it as if you're not already doing like electrical upgrades to the building, can you charge these costs through the reserve fund?
Always the hardest questions that need a written legal opinion come up in these. Okay. Well, I'm not going to give a definitive answer on this one, but I think, it really depends on what your engineer is telling you about your system. But I'll say keep it really pure and clean. And if it's an upgrade or an addition and capacity, like you're adding panels, my expectation was that is not out of the reserve fund, because we have to always remember what the reserve fund is for. Reserve fund is to anticipate replacing what is there, right? It is not necessarily to add components to that infrastructure. So I would suggest if you're adding components, it's brand new. Therefore, you either plan for it, in the future and you increase your common expenses to address it, because it's not there, right? It's not something that you can necessarily deal with. But I know for some condos, they have a green initiatives budget line item. Hi, Laura, you're back. We see you.
Sorry about that.
No worries. the Green Initiatives Reserve Fund component line item. Some condos had been building into their reserve fund budgets to save for initiatives that help improve environment impacts or energy efficiency. So I think the other thing is too, do you have one of those budget line items? I know in a condo where I sat on the board, we did. So when we had the LED retrofit upgrade, we were able to address this. So we went to a higher level, but we were very clear with our owners on what the purpose of that Green Initiatives Fund was for. So there are ways to think through this with your reserve fund planner. So I'm not sure if we have time for any further questions. We're at 1:05. Wow. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your time. We still had a ton of questions. We hoped we tried to cover most of them. Michelle, fabulous as always from management perspective. Laura, a real pleasure hearing of all the information that is out there on EV charging systems. We really appreciate that. I'd like to take an opportunity again to thank our sponsors. Without them, we could not provide you with these free seminars, and CondoTalk being one of those wonderful practical dialogues. So Belanger Engineering, Switch, EV Direct, and Elia Associates, we'd like to thank you all for supporting this initiative. We'd also like to let you know about some upcoming events. Introduction to Condominiums, March 4th from 5 to 7. So sign up. It's going to be really great. There are lots of phenomenal topics: money and banking, reserve funds, owners meetings. We also have rapid fire legal Q&A. You know, that's one of my favorites. Always learn a lot from lawyers. And what we're asking is that you get your legal questions in advance. March 25th is the date for the presentation. It'll be jam-packed for sure. And we need your feedback. We would appreciate you all taking the time to fill out the survey to help the chapter improve and get other content in that you want to hear about. As well, I wanted to let everybody know that Switch has taken the time to also put together a handout for you to download. So thank you very much, Switch, for taking the time to do that. It may answer some of the questions we weren't able to get to today. And if you have follow-ups, Laura, are you okay if people just reach out to you directly to ask further questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to also mention, we have put together recently a really great case study for a multifamily retrofit. It was an older building with, hundreds of units, and essentially what they did was they upgraded the electrical infrastructure to support up to 40 charging stations. So 14 charging stations were installed initially, and there's capacity for up to 40. So I think that would be a really great resource for people because it provides a lot of context in terms of the types of information you should be, or the types of factors you should be thinking about.
Great.
So if you reach out, happy to share that and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. Michelle, any closing words?
No, I think it was a great session, and I'm glad to be participating with you two ladies.
Thanks very much. So have a great afternoon,
Thanks
everybody.
so much.